1. Where is the rift? Marx, Capitalism, and Ecology. When, decades ago, ecology emerged as a crucial theoretical and practical issue, many Marxists, as well as critics of Marxism, noted that nature, more precisely the exact ontological status of nature, is the one topic in which even the crudest dialectical materialism has an advantage over Western Marxism. Dialectical materialism allows us to think of humanity as part of nature, while Western Marxism considers socio-historical dialectics as the ultimate horizon of reference, and, ultimately, reduces nature to a background of the historical process. Nature is a historical category, as Georg Lukács put it. Kohei Saito's Karl Marxism, Ecosocialism is the latest, most consistent attempt to redress the balance and think of humanity's embeddedness in nature without regressing to dialectical materialist general ontology. Since the main philosophical reference of Western Marxism is Hegel, no wonder that Saito aggressively rejects the Hegelian inheritance. In contrast to Saito and other eco-socialists, our premise is that the problems we are confronting now, pandemic, global warming, compel us not to abandon Hegel, but to return from Marx to Hegel. With one proviso: we should return to Hegel after passing through Marx, through his critique of political economy. When Robert Brandom points out that Hegel is ultimately telling the same story again and again, the story of the rise of modernity, of the passage from traditional organic society to a modern alienated one, he focuses on two aspects of this passage, arguably the most radical passage in the entire history of humanity after the rise of the Neolithic: the break in religion and philosophy, Protestantism, Cartesian subjectivity, and the French Revolution. What is missing here? Although Hegel read Smith and other early political economists, he ignores the key role of capitalism and industrial revolution. Duane Ruel perspicuously noted the basic ambiguity of the desperate search for the alternatives to capitalism. Quote, "If the radical philosophers, including Marx and Bakunin, were quick to ask, 'What about the alternatives?' then it was because they sometimes failed to see that capitalism has assumed the position of alternative. Capitalism is the alternative to authoritarianism, dogmatism, socialism, and so on." End of quote. It is not only that capitalism can only thrive through permanent self-revolutionizing, as Marx pointed out. It is that capitalism again and again emerges as the only alternative, the only way to move forward, the dynamic force which intervenes when social life gets stuck into some fixed form. Today, capitalism is much more revolutionary than the traditional left, which is obsessed with protecting the old achievements of the welfare state. Just recall how much capitalism has changed the entire texture of our societies in recent decades. Many leftists in the West are so obsessed with the critique of neoliberal capitalism that they neglect the big change, the passage from neoliberal capitalism to a strange post-capitalism, which some analysts call corporate neo-feudalism. How did it come to this? Neoconservative Communism. When, due to the crucial role of the general intellect, social knowledge and cooperation, in the creation of wealth, forms of wealth are more and more out of all proportion to the direct labor time spent on their production, the result is not, as Marx expected, the self-dissolution of capitalism, but the gradual transformation of the profit generated by the exploitation of labor into rent, appropriated by the privatization of the general intellect and other commons. Let us take the case of Bill Gates. How did he become one of the richest men in the world? Because Microsoft imposed itself as an almost universal standard, almost monopolizing the field, a kind of direct embodiment of the general intellect. Things are similar with Jeff Bezos and Amazon, with Apple, Facebook, etc., etc. In all these cases, commons themselves, the platforms, spaces of our social exchange and interaction, are privatized, which puts us, their users, into the position of serfs, paying a rent to the owner of a common as our feudal master. We recently learned that 2% of Elon Musk's wealth could solve world hunger, says director of UN Food Scarcity Organization. A clear indication of corporate neo-feudalism. With regard to Facebook, quote, Mark Zuckerberg has unilateral control over 3 billion people due to his unassailable position at the top of Facebook. The whistleblower Frances Haugen told the British MPs as she called for urgent external regulation to rein in the tech company's management and reduce the harm being done to society. End of quote. The big achievement of modernity, the public space, is thus disappearing. This new phase of global economy also implies a different functioning of the financial sphere. Yanis Varoufakis noted a weird fact that became evident in the spring of 2020. On the same day that state statistics in the US and the UK registered a breathtaking fall in GDP, comparable to the fall at the time of the Great Recession, stock markets registered a gigantic rise. In short, although the real economy is stagnating or even shrinking, stock markets go up, an indication that fictitious financial capital is caught in its own circle, decoupled from the real economy. This is where the financial measures justified by the pandemic entered the game. They, in a way, turn around the traditional Keynesian procedure, i.e., their aim was not to help the real economy, but to invest enormous amounts of money into the financial sphere, to prevent a financial collapse like the one of 2008, while making sure that most of this money will not flow into the real economy, as this could cause hyperinflation. But what makes the situation really dangerous, pushing us into a new barbarism, is that privatized commons coexist with a new wave of strong nation-state competition, which runs directly against the urgent need to establish a new mode of relating to our environs. A radical politico-economic change, which Peter Sloterdijk calls the domestication of the wild animal culture. Until now, each culture disciplined, educated its own members and guaranteed civic peace among them. But the relationship between different cultures and states was permanently under the shadow of potential war, with each period of peace nothing more than a temporary armistice. The entire ethic of a state culminates in the highest act of heroism, the readiness to sacrifice one's life for one's nation-state, which means that the wild barbarian relations between states serve as the foundation of the ethical life within a state. Today, things are getting even worse. Instead of civilizing the relations between cultures, the ongoing privatization of commons undermines the ethical substance within each culture, pushing us back into barbarism. However, the moment we fully accept the fact that we live on a spaceship Earth, the task that urgently imposes itself is that of forging universal solidarity and cooperation among all human communities. There is no higher historical necessity that pushes us in this direction. History is not on our side. It tends towards our collective suicide. As Walter Benjamin wrote, our task today is not to push forward the train of historical progress, but to pull the emergency brake before we all end in post-capitalist barbarism. In recent months, the often alarming ways in which the crisis of the COVID-19 pandemic has been intertwined with ongoing social, political, climatic, and economic crises are increasingly apparent. The pandemic must be treated together with global warming, erupting class antagonisms, patriarchy, and misogyny, and the many other ongoing crises which resonate with it and with each other in a complex interplay. This interplay is uncontrollable and full of dangers, and we cannot count on any guarantee in heaven to make the solution clearly imaginable. Such a risky situation makes our moment an eminently political one. It is only against this background that we can understand what is going on now in China. The recent Chinese campaign against big corporations and the opening of a new stock exchange in Beijing, dedicated to the promotion of small firms, can also be seen as moves against neo-feudal corporatism, i.e., as attempts to bring back normal capitalism. The irony of the situation is obvious. A strong communist regime is needed to keep capitalism alive against the threat of neo-feudal corporatist post-capitalism. This is why one should follow with great interest the writings of Wang Huning, a current member of the party's Politburo Standing Committee and the director of the Central Guidance Commission on Building Spiritual Civilization. Wang is correct in emphasizing the key role of culture, of the domain of symbolic fictions. The true materialist way to oppose the topic of the fiction of reality, subjectivist doubts in the style of is what we perceive as reality not just another fiction, is not to strictly distinguish between fiction and reality, but to focus on the reality of fictions. Fictions are not outside reality. They are materialized in our social interactions, in our institutions and customs. As we can see in today's mess, if we destroy fictions on which our social interactions are based, our social reality itself begins to fall apart. Wang designated himself as a neoconservative. What does this mean? If one is to trust our big media, Wang is the leading light against the recent new orientation of Chinese politics. When I read that one of the measures lately imposed by the Chinese government is the prohibition of 996, I must admit my first association was a sexual one. In our parlance, 69 means the position in which the man performs cunnilingus on the woman and the woman fellatio on the man. And I thought 996 must refer to some perverted sexual practice becoming widespread in China and involving two men and a woman, as there is a relative lack of women there. Then I learned that 996 means a brutal work rhythm imposed by many corporations in China. A working day from 9 a.m. to 9 p.m., 6 days a week. But in a sense, I was not completely wrong. The ongoing campaign in China has a double target: more economic equality, inclusive of better conditions of work, and the elimination of westernized popular culture focused on sex, consumerism, and fandom. So, what does being a neoconservative mean in today's conditions? In mid-October 2019, the Chinese media launched an offensive, promoting the claim that demonstrations in Europe and South America are the direct result of Western tolerance of Hong Kong unrest. In a commentary published in Beijing News, former Chinese diplomat Wang Zhen wrote that, quote, "The disastrous impact of a chaotic Hong Kong has begun to influence the Western world," end of quote, i.e., that demonstrators in Chile and Spain were taking their cues from Hong Kong. Along the same lines, an editorial in the Global Times accused Hong Kong demonstrators of exporting revolution to the world. Quote, "The West is paying the price for supporting riots in Hong Kong, which has quickly kindled violence in other parts of the world, and foreboded the political risks that the West can't manage. There are many problems in the West and all kinds of undercurrents of dissatisfaction. Many of them will eventually manifest in the way the Hong Kong protests did." End of quote. The ominous conclusion was that Catalonia is probably just the beginning. The idea that demonstrations in Barcelona and Chile are taking their cues from Hong Kong is far-fetched. These outbursts exploded into a general discontent which was obviously already there, lurking, waiting for a contingent trigger to explode. So that even when the particular law or measure was repealed, protests persisted. Communist China discreetly plays on the solidarity of those in power all around the world against the rebellious populace, warning the West not to underestimate dissatisfaction in their own countries, as if beneath ideological and geopolitical tensions, they all share the same basic interest in holding on to power. But will this defense work? Wang sees his task as imposing a new common ethical substance, and we should not dismiss this as an excuse to impose the full control of the Communist Party over social life. Wang is addressing a real problem. 30 years ago, he wrote a book, America Against America, where he perspicuously noted the antagonisms of the American way of life, including its darker sides: social disintegration, lack of solidarity and shared values, nihilist consumerism, and individualism. Trump's populism was a false way out. It was the climax of social disintegration, because it introduced obscenity into public speech, and thus deprived it of its dignity, something not only prohibited, but totally unimaginable in China. We will definitely never see a senior Chinese politician doing what Trump did publicly: talk about the size of his penis, imitating a woman's orgasmic sounds. Wang's fear was that the same disease might spread to China, which is now happening at the popular level of mass culture, and the ongoing reforms are a desperate attempt to put a stop to this trend. Again, will it work? It is easy to perceive in the ongoing campaign a tension between content and form. The content, the establishment of stable values that hold a society together, is enforced in the form of mobilization, which is experienced as a kind of emergency state imposed by the state apparatus. Although the goal is the opposite of the Cultural Revolution, there are similarities with it in the way the campaign is carried out. The danger is that such tensions can produce cynical disbelief in the population. More generally, the ongoing campaign in China seems all too close to a standard conservative attempt to enjoy the benefits of capitalist dynamism, but to control its destructive aspects through a strong nation state, pushing forward patriotic values. Therein resides the trap. Carlo Ginzburg proposed the notion that shame for one's country, not love of it, may be the true mark of belonging to it. A supreme example of such shame occurred back in 2014, when hundreds of Holocaust survivors and descendants of survivors bought an ad in Saturday's New York Times condemning what they referred to as the massacre of Palestinians in Gaza and the ongoing occupation and colonization of historic Palestine. Quote, "We are alarmed by the extreme racist dehumanization of Palestinians in Israeli society, which has reached a fever pitch," said the statement. Maybe today some Israelis will gather the courage to feel shame apropos of what the Israelis are doing on the West Bank and in Israel itself. Not, of course, in the sense of feeling ashamed to be Jewish, but, on the contrary, of feeling shame for what Israeli politics in the West Bank is doing to the most precious legacy of Judaism itself. "My country, right or wrong," is one of the most disgusting of mottos, and it illustrates perfectly what is wrong with unconditional patriotism. The same holds for China today. The space in which we can develop such critical thinking is the space of the public use of reason. In the famous passage of his What is Enlightenment, Immanuel Kant opposes the public and the private use of reason. Private is not one's individual space, as opposed to communal ties, but the very communal institutional order of one's particular identification, while public is the transnational universality of the exercise of one's reason. Quote, "The public use of one's reason must always be free, and it alone can bring about enlightenment among men. The private use of one's reason, on the other hand, may often be very narrowly restricted, without particularly hindering the progress of enlightenment. By public use of one's reason, I understand the use which a person makes of it as a scholar before the reading public. Private use, I call that which one may make of it in a particular civil post or office which is entrusted to him." End of quote. This is why Kant's formula of enlightenment is not "don't obey, think freely," and is not "don't obey, think and rebel," but "think freely, state your thoughts publicly, and obey." The same holds for vaccine doubters. Debate, publish your doubts, but obey regulations when the public authority imposes them. Without such practical consensus, we will slowly drift into a society composed of tribal factions, as is happening in many Western countries. But without the space for the public use of reason, the state itself courts the danger of becoming just another instance of the private use of reason. The space for the public use of reason is not the same as democracy in the Western liberal sense. In his last active year, Lenin himself saw the necessity of such an organ embodying the public use of reason. While admitting the dictatorial nature of Soviet regime, he proposed the establishment of a Central Control Commission, an independent, educational and controlling body with an apolitical edge, consisting of the best teachers and technocratic specialists monitoring the politicized CC and its organs. In dreaming, his expression, about the kind of work to be done by the CCC, he describes how this body should resort, quote, to some semi-humorous tricks, cunning device, piece of trickery, or something of that sort. I know that in the staid and earnest states of Western Europe, such an idea would horrify people, and that not a single decent official would even entertain it. I hope, however, that we have not yet become as bureaucratic as all that, and that in our midst the discussion of this idea will give rise to nothing more than amusement. Indeed, why not combine pleasure with utility? Why not resort to some humorous or semi-humorous trick to expose something ridiculous, something harmful, something semi-ridiculous, semi-harmful, etc. End of quote. Maybe China needs a similar Central Control Commission. With the neoconservative turn in China, a whole cycle of emancipatory politics has closed. In his Notes Towards a Definition of Culture, the great conservative T.S. Eliot remarked that there are moments when the only choice is the one between heresy and non-belief, when the only way to keep a religion alive is to perform a sectarian split from its main corpse. Lenin did this with regard to traditional Marxism. Mao did this in his own way. And this is what has to be done today. When, in 1922, after achieving victory in the civil war against all the odds, the Bolsheviks had to retreat into the NEP, the new economic policy of allowing a much wider scope for the market economy and private property, Lenin wrote a short text on ascending a high mountain. He uses the simile of a climber who has to retreat back to the valley from his first attempt to reach a new mountain peak in order to describe what a retreat means in a revolutionary process, i.e., how does one retreat without opportunistically betraying one's fidelity to the cause. After enumerating the achievements and the failures of the Soviet state, Lenin concludes, quote, "Communists who have no illusions, who do not give way to despondency, and who preserve their strength and flexibility to begin from the beginning, over and over again, in approaching an extremely difficult task, are not doomed, and in all probability will not perish." This is Lenin at his Beckettian best, echoing the line from the Westward Ho. Try again, fail better. His conclusion, to begin from the beginning over and over again, makes it clear that he is not talking merely of slowing down progress and consolidating what has already been achieved, but precisely of descending back to the starting point. One should begin from the beginning, not from where one succeeded in ascending in a previous effort. In Kierkegaard's terms, a revolutionary process is not a gradual process, but a repetitive movement, a movement of repeating the beginning again and again. And this, exactly, is where we are today, after the obscure disaster of 1989, the definitive end of the epoch which began with the October Revolution. One should therefore reject the continuity with what left meant in the last 2 centuries. Although sublime moments like the Jacobin climax of the French Revolution and the October Revolution will forever remain a key part of our memory, that story is over. Everything should be rethought. One should begin from the 0 point. As noted above, capitalism is more revolutionary today than the traditional left, which is obsessed with protecting the achievements of the welfare state. Again, we should remember how capitalism has changed our societies over recent decades. This is why the strategy of the radical left today should combine pragmatism with a principled stance in a way which cannot but recall Lenin's New Economic Policy, NEP, from the early 1920s, when Soviet power allowed a certain degree of private property and market economy. The NEP was obviously the original model for Deng Xiaoping's reforms, which opened the way to a capitalist free market under the control of the ruling Communist Party. Instead of a half decade of market liberalization, we already have in China half a century of what they euphemistically call socialism with Chinese characteristics. So, has China, for over half a century, been following a gigantic new economic policy? Instead of making fun of those measures, or simply denouncing them as a defeat of socialism, as a step towards authoritarian capitalism, we should take the risk of extending this logic to its extreme. After the disintegration of the East European socialism in 1990s, a joke circulated, according to which socialism is a transition from capitalism back to capitalism. But what if we make the opposite move and define capitalism itself as a socialist new economic policy, as a passage from feudalism or pre-modern societies of domination in general to socialism, with the abolishment of pre-modern direct personal relations of servitude and domination, with the assertion of principles of personal freedom and human rights. Capitalist modernity is in itself already socialist. No wonder that modernity again and again gave birth to revolts against domination, which already pointed towards economic equality. Large peasants' revolts in Germany in the early 1500s, the Jacobins, etc. Capitalism is a passage from pre-modernity to socialism, in the sense of a compromise formation. It accepts the end of direct relations of domination, i.e., the principle of personal freedom and equality, but, as Marx put it in his classic formulation, it transposes domination from relations between people to relations between things, commodities. As individuals, we are all free, but domination persists in the relationship between commodities that we exchange on the market. This is why, for Marxism, the only way to reach an actual life of freedom is to abolish capitalism. For partisans of capitalism, of course, this solution is utopian. Is the lesson of Stalinism not precisely that if you abolish capitalism, freedom is also abolished, and personal domination returns in a direct and brutal way? And when capitalism is in crisis, it can also resuscitate feudal elements to survive. Is this not going on today with the role of megacorporations, which prompted some economists and social analysts to speak about neo-feudal corporate capitalism? This, then, is the true alternative today. Neither capitalism or socialism, nor liberal democracy or rightist populism, but what kind of post-capitalism? Corporate neo-feudalism or socialism? Will capitalism ultimately be just a passage from a lower to a higher stage of feudalism, or will it be a passage from feudalism to socialism? So we are back to Lenin's question. What is to be done? Ne demande que fait, que celui dont le désir c'était. Only the one whose desire is waning asks what is to be done. Is Lacan's wonderful formula to be read as an implicit critique of Lenin? No. Although Lenin's title is a question, the book is a clear answer. It provides precise guidelines as to what is to be done. The title works like similar titles of introductory textbooks. What is quantum physics? What is biogenetics? Etc. When today's post-Marxists write treatises where they ponder endlessly on what to do, on what might be the agent of radical change, their desperate doubt and search effectively bears witness to the waning of their desire to really embark on a radical change. They don't really desire change. They rather enjoy the endless self-critical pondering which, as they know well, will not lead to any clear result. Referring to Lenin's shift towards NEP in the last years of his life, Alvaro Garcia Linera provided a precise analysis of how, when an authentic radical leftist party takes state power through elections, it shouldn't attempt to impose radical measures, like the abolition of capitalism, directly through a state decision and laws. He warns that nationalization, the change from private to state property, does not eliminate the gap between producers and means of production, and that one should proceed very cautiously in the overcoming of capitalism. Every authentic socialization of the means of production should not be imposed by the state, but should grow out of self-organization of civil society. And, in the meantime, the leftist state power should find a way to coexist with private business, even with big corporations, to prevent economic crisis, in the same way that the equality of women cannot just be imposed by the state, but should grow out of women's self-organized struggle. While I fully support these premises, I think that Linera still puts too much weight on grassroots democracy in local communities, or, in general, on society versus state. In today's complex societies, something like the state is needed to provide a well-functioning background of self-organized local communities, the global network of health and education services, of water and electricity, etc. And this network cannot grow from below, out of cooperation among local communities, since it must always already be here for communities to survive. This network is also needed in order to prevent local communities or interest groups getting caught in competition for privileges. In short, however alienated, the global interest has to exist in a reified institutional form to control the excesses of local communities, as well as to coordinate their interaction. Parliamentary democracy is definitely not the only way to establish and control the institutional form which gives body to the global interest. If we understand by democracy what this term predominantly means today, parliamentary representative democracy, then I am definitely not a democratic socialist, but rather a non-democratic communist. However, what we should be aware of is the fateful limit of anarchism. An anarchist replies to the reproach that he is not able to provide a positive model of how the future society should look. I don't want to tell people what to think. I want them to think. Although this is a nice, rhetorically effective answer, it rests on a false presupposition that people want to think for themselves if given the opportunity. As Deleuze insisted, people spontaneously don't want to think. Thinking is an effort that goes against the grain of our spontaneous inclinations, so that strong pressure is needed to make them think. If we want to perceive clearly the communist potential of what goes on today, We should bear in mind the fundamental break in the relationship between the two sexes that is already taking place in movements like LGBT+ and Me Too. These movements threaten to undermine the most elementary patriarchal order that emerged before the rise of class society itself, with the Neolithic, which led to the establishment of permanent settlements. Marx neglected the significance of this break, the importance of which is equal to the capitalist industrial revolution. In the entire history of humanity, there have only been two truly radical breaks: the Neolithic and capitalist industrial revolution. Critics of patriarchy who attack it as if it is still a hegemonic position ignore what Marx and Engels wrote more than 150 years ago in the first chapter of the Communist Manifesto. Quote, "The bourgeoisie, wherever it has got the upper hand, has put an end to all feudal, patriarchal, idyllic relations." End of quote. What becomes of the patriarchal family values when a child can sue his parents for neglect and abuse? i.e., when family and parenthood itself are de jure reduced to a temporary and dissolvable contract between independent individuals. Although late capitalism is still a class society, it thus undermines the patriarchal order which arose back in pre-class societies, and this aspect of capitalism should be unconditionally supported by all partisans of radical emancipation. This, of course, in no way means that we should not ferociously resist temporary setbacks like the ongoing disaster patriarchy, a process parallel to disaster capitalism, where men exploit a crisis to reassert control and dominance and rapidly erase hard-earned women's rights. All over the world, patriarchy has taken full advantage of the virus to reclaim power. On the one hand, escalating danger and violence to women, and on the other, stepping in as their supposed controller and protector. The disaster is here, of course, that of the COVID-19 pandemic. Marx was here more Hegelian than Hegel. What he saw was precisely the Hegelian structure of the reproduction of capital. But here an ambiguity arises. There are two opposite ways in which Hegel's dialectics and the logic of capital are linked.